Good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and what an honor it is to have as our guest this morning, Mr. David Talbot. You know, I could spend the whole podcast talking about David's career, his astounding family. I'm just going to mention a couple things about him. He's the founder and former editor-in-chief of Salon.com. He pioneered that site. He's the author of Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, and of course, his most recent book, The Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government. David, I do just have to tell you about one of my favorite moments in the history of the American media, not for what had happened to you, but for what it revealed about things, was when Chris Matthews had you on Hardball to talk about Brothers. And he spent the entire interview shouting at you, how dare you raise questions about the Kennedy assassination? How dare you question Johnson's role, CIA's role, and so forth? I guess he has no sense of irony or introspection or whatever, but I thought for anybody looking at that was sort of all you needed to know about how guys like that in the media play their role.
Yeah, that was one of the low points for me as well. And of course, he brought in Vince Bugliosi, too, to team up with him. So it was like one of those wrestling matches, 2-on-1. But Vince...
It didn't work.
It didn't work because at one point, Vince got cut off, much to his rage. You know, I don't think it was intentional, but it was definitely a three-ring circus. You know, I've edited Chris Matthews actually in my days back at the old San Francisco Examiner when he was a columnist for us from Washington. You know, I'm fond of Chris personally, but I think he has come to represent everything that's the problem with the American media, particularly the Beltway media, the Washington media. These people live in a bubble. They've been living in a bubble their whole careers. They're well paid. They're not going to challenge any deep taboos. They're not going to go there, particularly when it comes to subjects like the JFK assassination, which is this ongoing trauma for America. So I've lost quite a bit of respect for Chris over the years, and there's not many people, frankly, in the sort of establishment media world that I do have much respect for these days.
You know, it seems like I've hated the Dulles brothers all my life. I didn't like John Foster. Everything I learned about him made me dislike him more. I've never liked Allen Dulles, but I must say you're bringing a new depth of understanding to anybody interested in the evil of Allen Dulles, to what an amazingly significant figure. I mean, everybody, I think, always thought he was significant. You show he's far more significant than any of us thought.
Well, yeah, I mean, the name Dulles has been largely lost now in American history, except for the airport in Washington, which, of course, is named after John Foster Dulles, not Allen Dulles. But yes, he and his brother, but particularly Allen, are very significant figures in what I call the rise of America's secret government, particularly in the years after World War II and through the Cold War. He's what I call Dick Cheney on steroids. I mean, in some ways, a much more powerful figure than Dick Cheney because of his connections to Wall Street, where he and his brother ran the largest law firm, because of his command of the national security system. He was obviously CIA director for 10 years, but even before then, almost a decade. But even before then, he was very critical in actually shaping and starting the CIA. So all these things that we're wrestling with as a country today, torture, extraordinary rendition, CIA black sites, massive surveillance of private citizens, assassinations by drones, and so on, you know, all of these have their origins not after 9/11, but actually during the Allen Dulles period as CIA director in the Cold War.
You know, there's obviously tremendous importance in simply telling the truth for the future, as well as just for point of virtue as against evil. What we might almost think of as, I guess, the modern American deep state that Dulles had so much to do with creating. Can its hold be broken, or are we in effect stuck with it?
Well, it certainly is an incredibly powerful force in American life. We see this my whole life. We've been at war. I'm 64 years old now, and we've lived in this permanent war state since World War II virtually. And there's, you know, corporate forces, there are political forces that benefit enormously from keeping the state, from keeping the country in this permanent state of war and permanent surveillance and so on. You know, C. Wright Mills, who's a hero in my book, and by the way, there are a number of heroes who resisted this deep state. C. Wright Mills was the famous sociologist at Columbia University in the 1950s who wrote the book The Power Elite, which was his way of describing the deep state and really in some ways started that whole thread of scholarship that now runs up through people like Peter Dale Scott and others who continue to investigate the deep operations of power. But, he said, referring to people like Dulles, such men as these are crackpot realists. In the name of realism, they've created a paranoid reality all of their own. And we're forced to live within that paranoid reality because it's enormously profitable for these people, whether it's the Cold War or now the war on terror. So how can we resist it? Well, it doesn't look great, I have to say, this presidential campaign, because not one significant candidate is even addressing the issue of permanent war in the secrecy state. After Ed Snowden, after all the convulsions we went through following that hasn't even emerged as a theme during the 2016 presidential campaign. Even Bernie Sanders, is focused almost exclusively on the wealth gap and is not really bringing this up. Rand Paul, I guess, had some critiques of it from his position, but he's faded quickly as a candidate. I don't know where that leaves us as a country, at least when it comes to kind of mainstream politics. I think what it's going to take, frankly, is as we suffer from one sort of imperial quagmire after the next, and as people are shocked by the kind of things our government is doing to us, treating us, the American citizenry, like we're the enemy, as Ed Snowden has pointed out, if finally we're going to just reach a point where we say enough, and then we're going to have to organize, and we're going to have to create a movement in this country, as happened to an extent after the Vietnam War in the 1970s, to demand that kind of transparency and that kind of accountability and power. There were congressional investigations in the 1970s into CIA abuses. There were a whole new generation of leaders elected to Congress who were accountable to the American people, or more so than the people whose places they took. So we need basically a cultural, I don't know, what do you call it, cultural, social, political revolution in this country, and a real one, not a phony one like the Tea Party.
How did Frank Church get away with it? Who famous church hearings are maybe not so famous anymore. And, I agree he had his shortcomings, but he exposed a tremendous amount of stuff about the CIA.
Yeah, well, Frank Church, I think, was an interesting case because he did come from that sort of populist strain in Idaho, the state he represented. He was aligned with the Kennedys, of course, and I think the assassinations of the two Kennedy brothers had a big impact on him, as did the war, of course, and all the kind of traumas that America was going through in the 1960s. He had his own political ambitions. Of course, he wanted to run for president. In some ways, I think the investigation that he oversaw on the Church Committee came to abrupt an end because of his political ambitions. And those went nowhere, by the way. I don't think there's any way someone who was challenging the system as much as Frank Church was going to be allowed to get anywhere near the White House. But he did open up a lot of things. The assassinations, the CIA assassinations of foreign leaders, he called the agency a rogue elephant. That was useful for the American people, and we did begin to get some understanding of what had happened under Allen Dulles during those Cold War years, when he had created basically a kill team, a very efficient kill team that had gone around the world targeting a number of people from Fidel Castro to Patrice Lumumba in the Congo and others. And, the CIA testified during those hearings, we were the gang that couldn't shoot straight. We weren't very good at assassination. Well, they were being far too modest because only a few of the people that they targeted were named in the Church hearings and many others were not. People who were below kind of the radar, like journalists and opposition political leaders and other activists in these different countries where the United States was trying to suppress all dissent with local regimes. And so a number of people were killed in places like Guatemala, which turned into one of the worst killing fields of the 20th century because of the CIA coup there and all the subsequent horrors that happened afterwards. So, this is a very blood-stained legacy that Allen Dulles helped create. I think we're still wrestling with this on our conscience today.
David, speaking of blood-stained legacies, tell us a little bit about Allen Dulles and the murder of John F. Kennedy. You've responsible not only for, I would say, tremendously comprehensive and fascinating accounts of all of this, but you've uncovered new evidence. You've come up with some brilliant new insights that helps us understand, to the extent we can understand, exactly what happened and who did it.
Yeah, well, I think this is the most explosive part of the book, and it's the last third. And I do make a case that Allen Dulles, who had been fired by Kennedy after the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in April 1961, shortly after that, JFK forces him out of office. He's very bitter about it, Allen Dulles. And what I show in the book for the first time is that Dulles didn't basically get the memo that he'd been fired. He goes to his home in Georgetown and continues to operate as if he's still running the CIA. He meets with top-level deputies from the agency. He meets with field agents from the agency. And he supports policies, secret policies that the CIA is undertaking to actually subvert Kennedy administration policy in one place after the next, particularly when it came to Cuba. Among the many mysterious characters he's meeting with in so-called retirement is an anti-Castro Cuban exile leader named Paulina Sierra Martinez, who is a former Batista thug who pops up in the United States and begins to raise money, and it looks like from mafia sources as well as corporate sources, to create another invasion force to reinvade Cuba after the Bay of Pigs. Well, the Secret Service later suspects him of a plot against JFK. This comes out during a later congressional hearing. And here's the retired director of the CIA meeting with this guy, very dangerous guy. The other thing that was going on, which I bring out in the book, which I think is a very important revelation, William Harvey, who is the very violent CIA guy who Allen Dulles put in charge of the operation to kill Castro, working with the mafia. William Harvey is forced to go overseas because the Kennedy brothers hate him. And to save his career, the CIA sends him to Rome, where he becomes Rome station chief in 1963, in summer that year. Well, his own deputy, and this is the new thing in my book, spots him on an airplane from Rome to Dallas. And when he asks him why he's going to Dallas, of all places, in November 63, before the assassination of the president, Harvey tells his deputy, I'm going just to look around. He's very evasive. Well, I believe that William Harvey, who, as I said, was the head of the assassination team, is just one of several key CIA figures who are later identified as being in Texas and Dallas in November 1963. And this sighting is a particularly important one. Harvey's deputy, his own deputy, told his grown children later after he'd left the agency that he was convinced that Bill Harvey was in some ways involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. Where is Allen Dulles himself on the weekend of the assassination? He's retired now, remember, for 2 years. He's not home watching television like the rest of America. He's at a top-secret remote facility in Northern Virginia run by the CIA known as the Farm, which he had sort of created while he was CIA director as an alternate command center. And we don't know what he was doing there, but he was at the CIA facility that very fateful weekend where Kennedy's killed. And then the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, is himself gunned down by someone who Robert Kennedy, Attorney General at the time, later found was a mafia errand boy, Jack Ruby. So, this is history that leads, I think, to obvious conclusions. And I make those conclusions in the book. And I've been challenged by some people in the mainstream media. But this is evidence that I find glaring, that there was indeed a conspiracy, and we could go on and on. There's many other pieces of evidence I compile in the book. But the American media has refused to look at this. The elites of the world, and I have a whole story about Charles de Gaulle, president of France, who himself was the target of a CIA-supported military coup, right on the heels, by the way, of the Bay of Pigs in April 61. It's an astounding story. And Kennedy had no idea what was going on and was in the embarrassing position of having to tell de Gaulle that he was not in control of his own CIA. But Charles de Gaulle himself later said, the same U.S. national security forces that targeted me killed President Kennedy. This is the kind of insider conversations that were happening about the assassination of Kennedy afterwards. People like Dick Nixon, LBJ, de Gaulle, Bobby Kennedy, people at the top of the media chain, like Don Hewitt at 60 Minutes, who I interviewed, or Ben Bradley, the Washington Post editor. They all knew basically what had happened, that it was an inside job. But that was too traumatic a conclusion for the media to look at. It would have shaken the very foundations of American power, the deep state. And so they didn't go there. And so it was up to a whole generation of independent researchers, brave American citizens, to do this research themselves. And then, of course, they were ridiculed and slammed by the media as nutcases, conspiracy theorists, and so on for their brave efforts. So, this is what we've been dealing with for 50 years now. But I think my book finally does bring this all together in a way that's very revealing, very convincing. And the book is already hitting a nerve with people.
David, don't you think that it's a wonderful sign that they've never succeeded in convincing the American people of the official story of the Kennedy assassination?
Yes.
Most Americans just still to this day don't believe it. So you've got a fertile field to plow for your book.
God bless the American people for their skepticism. They know that when they're being manipulated, lied to, played, spun, and this whole area of the Kennedy assassination reeks of it. I mean, it's happened again and again throughout American history. I mean, speaking of conspiracy theories, I mean, it's the government itself that often promotes conspiracy theories, whether it's Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, or that the North Vietnamese started the war at the Gulf of Tonkin, or that Saddam Hussein was producing weapons of mass destruction. These are all official U.S. government conspiracies that it's up to us to see through. Even lately, I think maybe in partly in response to my book, which I think the agency, the CIA, was concerned about, right before my book came out, they released suddenly these so-called, revealing documents.
Yeah, I know.
And the revealing documents pointed in the direction that Fidel Castro had killed President Kennedy.
Yeah.
Well, this is the oldest disinformation line, literally the oldest one in the book when it comes to the Kennedy assassination. While the president's body was still warm, the CIA was pumping out this lie that Fidel Castro was behind his killing throughout the media. And now they revive it again, just as my book comes out. And there's gullible journalists who always fall for it. In this case, Phil Shannon, who was a former New York Times reporter who ran with it, and the story ran in Politico online. But this is ridiculous. We all know this now. It's been knocked down again and again. In fact, Fidel Castro and JFK were engaged in secret peace talks at the time. In fact, the very moment that Kennedy is shot in Dallas, Castro is meeting with a peace envoy from JFK, a French journalist named Jean Daniel, who's carrying an olive branch to Havana from the president. And Castro is devastated when he hears the news because he realizes there's now no hope that he and the U.S. can come to peace with Lyndon Johnson coming into office. And then he says to Jean Daniel, now listen, they're going to try to pin this on me. And of course, the next broadcast from the U.S., they are indeed trying to do that, connecting Lee Harvey Oswald to Cuba and so on. So, this is the game they play. They pump out lies and distractions. They try to confuse the American public. But the American people, in its wisdom and skepticism, have said, you know what, we don't believe the official story. It's preposterous to think this young guy using a old World War II rifle with a faulty sight, not a very good marksman, can single-handedly pull off the sniper hat trick of the century. With all the other evidence that there was gunfire from multiple directions in Dealey Plaza, evidence that was suppressed by the Warren Report, just the American people have seen this for what it is. It's a cover-up.
And as you point out, this really should be known as the Dulles reports, as he was in actual control of it much more than Earl Warren was.
Yeah, well, that's the other astounding thing. I mean, how many kind of preposterous things can they pile up and the media not finally acknowledge how absurd this is. So here's the guy who, should have been on the witness stand himself, this disgruntled former employee of Kennedy administration, fired by Kennedy under very bitter circumstances, who goes home and connives against the presidency. And he ends up sitting on the commission, the Warren Commission, to investigate the president's murder. How convenient. And, like you say, a number of people, he was so active on that commission. He was the only one who was retired, so he didn't have a day job. He could devote himself fully to the commission's work, and he does. And he can, speaking of conspiring, he conspires with the CIA, and this is all documented fact at this point. He conspires with his former colleagues at the agency to direct and mislead that commission, particularly when it comes to the numerous pieces of evidence that showed there was contacts between Lee Harvey Oswald and intelligence agencies, including the CIA, leading up to Dallas. Dulles makes sure that none of that gets introduced into testimony. Later, the lie is put out by Lyndon Johnson, among others, that it was Bobby Kennedy, of all people, who persuaded Lyndon Johnson to put Dulles on the commission. I mean, this is ridiculous on the face of it, because LBJ and Bobby Kennedy were barely speaking. They hated one another. the idea that LBJ would consult with his mortal enemy on the makeup of such a delicate political commission is absurd. In fact, what I show in the book, by the admission of Dulles' own men at the CIA, was that it was the CIA people who lobbied LBJ very strenuously to put Dulles on the commission, and Lyndon Johnson went along with that.
David, just one more point. I'm thinking of another red thread of evil that runs through a lot of American history. And even thinking of your great book on Smedley Butler, did George H.W. Bush as a young CIA agent have any role in this?
Well, that's a question I know that my friend Russ Baker, who wrote Family of Secrets, which was a very great and revealing book on the Bush dynasty, and he goes heavily into that. He knows much more about this subject than I do. I do know that the Bush family, particularly Prescott Bush, who's the senator from Connecticut who creates the political dynasty, was very tight with Allen Dulles. Prescott Bush was, in fact, the CIA's man in the Senate. Whatever Dulles wanted from the Senate in the way of budget or support, he would go first to Prescott Bush. And Prescott Bush was furious at JFK for firing Allen Dulles. And I discussed that in the book. So, yeah, there is, Prescott Bush, the Bush family, clearly part of this deep state, this permanent government that operates no matter who happens to be elected. But I can't myself, because I didn't do the research on my own, really talk much about what young Bush's involvement, if any, was in Dallas.
Well, he certainly did enough evil afterwards, even if he wasn't involved in that particular thing. Well, David, all of us are in your debt for writing all your books, this latest one especially, and I'm going to do everything possible I can to push its sales. I think it's so important that people read it and learn from it, and God bless you for what you're doing. Keep doing it. You're extremely valuable, and you have a lot of fans, as I'm sure you know, and may you have many more.
Well, from you, Lew, I particularly appreciate that, given everything you've done. So thank you so much for having me on the show.
Bye-bye, David.
Take care.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the LRC front page. Thank you.